There have been few more powerful painters of landscape than John Constable. He brought a scale, ambition and impact to a subject long considered amongst the lowest forms of art, but he's largely celebrated as a nostalgic painter of a lost England. Look a little harder at Constable's pictures though, and you discover an intense and radical vision at work which changed the course of British art. John Constable was born in June 1776 here in East Bergholt, a small village in Suffolk. He was the son of Anne and Golding Constable, a successful businessman, and he was christened in this church. But the real hubbub of family life and of his early childhood was a mile just down the road. This is Flatford Mill, Constable's father's mill, here on the banks of the River Stour, and it was this that was the very centre of the family business. In fact, Constable's father owned another watermill upriver, and also a windmill, as well as a boat-building business and the navigation rights on this very busy stretch of water, all of which provided the backdrop for Constable's carefree, happy, comfortable childhood. But it also fuelled his art for the rest of his life. Throughout the 1790s, the young Constable spent his time sketching the rolling countryside which surrounded him. And just as the century was coming to a close, Constable's parents reluctantly consented to their son leaving Suffolk and travelling to London to attend the Academy schools. 1802 was a key year for Constable. In April, he had his first exhibited painting at the Royal Academy. We don't know exactly what it was, but all accounts seem to point to a landscape. Then he was offered a job teaching at a Royal Military Academy, which in the end he declined because, as he put it, it would be a death blow to any prospects I might have of pursuing the art I love. And then he makes his most famous resolution. He says, "I now vow to become a natural painter." And this is one of a series of 3 or 4 works he makes in the summer of 1802, where we can see Constable trying to achieve what he set out to do. Now, the idea of a natural painter is a slippery one, and it changes throughout Constable's career. He says at the beginning, though, that he wants to produce a pure and unaffected view of nature, and he does that by plonking himself out in the fields and trying to sketch and then paint in oil what he sees. And the view that he gives us is elevated, looking east, across the Stour Valley. There's Dedham, with its church beautifully rendered, and then in the distance the estuary, the view out to sea. Now, at first sight, this looks a pretty good achievement, but there's a couple of things to throw into the melting pot. Certainly we're around the idea of pure naturalism. Firstly, the composition for this work is taken directly from a work now in the National Gallery, previously in the collection of George Beaumont, where Constable had seen it, called Hagar and the Angel, by the French artist Claude Lorraine. And here on the left-hand corner, where things are slightly fudged, in Claude's original painting, there are 2 figures wrestling, so he takes that out. So this is classically inspired. Secondly, look at the detailing, particularly on the trees and the flecking in the foreground, and you see an artist wrestling with the medium of oil paint. It's not something he is naturally adept at using. Now, at the Royal Academy, there was no instruction on how to paint, let alone on how to paint landscape. And what we see in works like this, which make them, I think, real jewels, is an artist somehow struggling to learn to paint, to learn to master his medium, and to find his own vision when confronted by nature. But there was no market for natural paintings, and Constable had no choice but to try and support himself by securing commissions for portraits. But as this painting shows, portraiture wasn't a skill he'd exactly perfected. Constable's struggle for work was temporarily resolved in 1809 when he got a commission to paint an altarpiece for this church in the village of Nayland, a few miles away from Flatford. He got the commission because his aunt lived here in the village. And he produced an image of Christ blessing the sacraments, the bread and the wine, which hung, as it still does, behind the altarpiece. But his struggle for recognition continued, and according to his father, Constable's employment relied entirely on the kindness of friends, and, as he put it, his son was still pursuing a shadow. In the same year, he fell in love with Maria Bicknell, the daughter of Charles Bicknell, the solicitor to the Admiralty. Mariah's family were sceptical that an out-of-work artist could provide for their daughter, and so it became even more crucial for Constable to develop his career. In 1811, Constable came here to the picturesque city of Salisbury to stay with the recently appointed Bishop of Salisbury, Dr. John Fisher, and his wife. Fisher himself was an amateur painter who'd met Constable a few years before and was very taken with the young artist. More importantly, Fisher also had a nephew, called John Fisher too, who became Constable's closest friend as a result of his stay here. And for the rest of his life, they wrote letters together, and it's through the letters to John Fisher that we know most of what Constable thought about the world and his art. Equally important, though, for Constable was this spectacular view. He stood where I'm standing now with his sketchbook in 1811, and then over the next 2 decades returned to paint this scene and produce some of his most iconic work here. This painting from a few years later, 1823, effectively made one of the most celebrated buildings in England into a national treasure. But Constable's craft as a painter was crystallised much closer to home. Constable painted what I think is his first major oil piece in the summer of 1814 when he was 39, which makes him quite a late developer. Right here, just near Flatford Mill, and the scene depicts boat building which would have taken place down here in this self-same pit. In fact, very little has changed in the scene. And we know that Constable made sketches in ink, but then set his easel up and worked straight onto the finished canvas. And he worked in 2 stages. First of all, he'd lay in using thin, opaque colours the basic composition of the men at work and the landscape, almost as it is now. And then, after a few days when it had dried, he'd use coarser, more granular paint to put in the fine details, the foliage, the light, and so on. But we know from letters that he worked through to the late afternoon until, as he says, he could see the smoke billowing from Bridge Cottage just next door, and that was the sign that the fires had been lit and that supper was just about to be cooked. In the sketch, we see a very bustling scene of activity, of boats being built, which is slightly modified and made more tranquil in the finished oil. There's a man down there who seems to be resting, but there's a coil of rope underneath, and perhaps he's scraping away or carving at some fine detail. On the banks just over there, on the flat